welcome to the LARPed podcast, where we discuss all things live action roleplay, storytelling, and tabletop role-playing games. I'm your host, Tara M. Clapper, she, her, and we're getting ready to discuss LARP today on July 9th, 2023. My guest today is Min Kreiner, they, them, of Carcosa Creations, and they are the co-founder and game designer there. Welcome, Min.
Thank you so much, Tara. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you so much for coming on and chatting with me about all sorts of gaming stuff, and I'm so looking forward to learning from you. So today, for those who aren't familiar with my background, I've done a bit in live action role-playing games, but today I'm here to learn from Min about all of the cool stuff they're good at doing that I'm not. So this is like knowledge gap central for me. And Min, I'm so excited to learn about all of the aspects of LARP production that I know very little to nothing about.
That sounds fantastic. And I always love doing this because it's a very, very deep passion of mine.
So for those who aren't familiar with live action role playing, I would love to hear in your own words what LARP is, and maybe a little bit about what you do a little differently at Carcosa from some other LARP producers and designers.
Fantastic. So LARP to us, and this is the definition that I use because we get a lot of brand new LARPers to our games, is the hybrid blending of the role-playing that you experience in tabletop role-playing games with improvisational theater. Now, where you're in a tabletop game, you're using dice and having a stat sheet, and you're saying, oh, I'm going to swing my sword now. Whereas in LARP, you're actually embodying the action instead of just rolling and explaining with your voice or possibly typing with your words if you're working online.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for describing that. And at Carcosa Creations, what is it that you do differently, or perhaps what is your specialty? Like, what do people go to you for that they can't get at other LARPs necessarily?
We at Carcosa Creations are proud to provide Lovecraftian style one-shot convention scenarios. What I mean by that is we focus on Lovecraftian and cosmic style horror. We typically run our games at conventions, and all of our games are within a set convention time slot. So in most conventions, that is 4 to 5 hours in length. You will get the entire story start to finish, and you don't need to worry about missing something if you have to come back the next day or if you have something else going on at the con. You get the entire story in that chunk, and that's what we tend to focus on. We have over 50 different scenarios that we have written at this point.
Excellent. Now, I want to go a little bit from start to finish in terms of creating this wonderful adventure that is LARP. So you have something written, ready to produce, and you look at a convention and say, I would like to run my LARP here. From the logistics side of it, which I'm very bad at, notoriously, what is your first step? Like, what do you do to get your game on the schedule, let's say at Gen Con?
So typically, actually, with the exception of Gen Con and Origins because of their size, we talk to the convention first before we even start our writing phase. A lot of times with smaller conventions, you find that they have a particular theme that they're having for that con for that year, or in the case of some of our home cons like MEPACon, twice a year. So between fall and spring, they even have different themes to the con. We'll find out what the theme is in advance, and we will write a LARP to the convention's theme, which is another kind of signature thing that we do at Carcosa Creations. Now, at that point, obviously, we're saying, hey, we're going to be bringing a LARP to you. what's your theme? They already know that we're going to be coming and that we're producing a LARP. That's typically for conventions that we already have a long-standing relationship with, such as MEPICON in Middle Eastern Pennsylvania, Running Gag in Geneseo, New York, and Archon, which is at SUNY Oswego in New York. For other conventions that we haven't established a relationship with, I first get in contact with them to see if they even have a LARP space available. Unless it is a LARP specific con, a lot of cons don't necessarily navigate having a separate space for LARPs to be able to be run. We've run into it at a couple of conventions where they've stuck us literally in like a back room because they had no other place to put us, whether at a hotel or the one oddball scenario was at a ice skating rink where we were in one of the locker rooms to run our game.
Oh my gosh, I can't imagine. That must have been a very different experience.
Well, the moisture on the walls really lended to the feel of the World War I submarine scenario we were running called The Boat.
I bet. Well, that created some immersion there. And for those who are new to LARP, immersion is the way live action role-playing games and other types of theater or even tabletop role-playing games can create an environment, a story, or scenario in which the participants feel like they're really there, right? So if you've seen, your favorite movie, you might like it because you felt like you were there up front experiencing the action, adventure, or romance.
That is a really good way to describe immersion.
Thank you. And I would love to know more actually about the immersive aspect of what you do and some practical things you do to make that happen. Because from a storytelling standpoint, I feel like I'm really solid on knowing how to get somebody feeling like they're there. But when we talk about things like 360 immersion, where you walk into an environment and it looks and feels like you're there and all of your senses are engaged, how do you go about creating that physical sense of immersion? Because as somebody who runs online most of the time, the immersion that I create is usually through sound, through storytelling, through guided meditation, but I have no idea how to do that in a physical location. So please help me out.
So one of the things that makes our immersion setting techniques very malleable is the fact that we're taking the same scenario to multiple different conventions. We never know necessarily what space we are going to end up in. So for setting up the room, a lot of the times we're working with the standard round tables or rectangular tables that you find in a lot of banquet situations from hotels or convention centers, etc. We sometimes will use those to create physical walls in combination with the tablecloths and some tape. And it may look a little low budget, but then we up the production value by really making sure that the immersion's on point, both with our props and also with our sound design. One of the key signatures that we do is I'm our sound tech, and I actually have a virtual DJ board up on my screen while I'm running our games, and I will have sometimes up to 8 different sound files layering as I'm reacting in time to what the players are doing. So when they decide to poke something that they shouldn't, like they inevitably do in anything Lovecraftian, I respond and I make sure that their sanity takes a hit in a response.
That's fantastic. What a great way to get people immersed by engaging multiple senses at one time. And going along with that, you mentioned props.
Yes.
I'm very curious about if you could give a few examples of what kind of props or documents or anything people might encounter in game, any physical objects, like what might they find?
So we have a wide variety of props, and quite a few of them are ones that I have personally manufactured myself or have modified, because thankfully I came from a very crafty household and my mother taught me about a variety of different crafting techniques from young. I have since been able to join a local makerspace, Triple Cities Makerspace in Binghamton, New York, that I'm able to have access to a CO2 laser cutter engraver that is freaking huge. So I was able to recently make a gorgeous fake mirror prop for our recent run of The Crying of Lot 13 that debuted at Origins a few weeks ago. And I was able to use the laser cutter to be able to cut out all the filigree work, cut out the actual backing for the mirror, and then put in the acrylic sheet that I used for the replacement for glass, because I always have to think of safety. And I actually created this beautiful prop using a really cool new tool. I've also gotten to use the 3D printers there. I've previously done hand sculpting, whether with clay, paper mache. We also have, thanks to a friend of my husband's, Dante, he made a 6-foot tall working wooden guillotine, which is a signature prop of ours.
Oh, that's fantastic.
We have quite a few different props.
I bet. What would be like your dream prop? If you could get your hand on anything, no limits, what is it? You could have one prop. What would you get?
Oh, you had to ask the tough questions.
Of course. That's why I'm here.
Well, the guillotine that I mentioned is the prop that goes with the very first LARP that Kevin ever took from tabletop to LARP, Victim's Ball. And it is a crowd classic. And when I wrote my first LARP for Carcosa, The Opening of the Mouth, I wanted to have a 6-foot tall prop too. So I attempted to make a 6-foot tall sarcophagus.
Oh, that's fantastic. Were you able to do it?
I did. The only problem is Akhenaten got a little bit beat up in transport because plaster of Paris does not transport very well without cracking. So if I was able to get a custom, really nice, expensive prop, it would be a collapsible sarcophagus that I could actually, stuff a body in and, scare players with, later on in the game. Because of course I'm going to want to put an actor in there to jump scare somebody at some point. That would be my dream prop.
That sounds so fun. And speaking of scaring players and the whole Lovecraftian genre, could you tell us a little bit more about that genre?
Absolutely. So one of the things that we do is we very much acknowledge the problematic base of Lovecraft's work in Lovecraftian horror. And from there, we take it and make it as inclusive as possible. Kind of as a little bit of a, how do I put this politely? Against you for the past. So what we do for our horror, we have scenarios that range anywhere in time from ancient Egypt to a possible distant future. We do not stay in any one particular time period, especially because my husband's a historian by profession. So for bringing that horror to the game, we use a couple of different things. Mostly we use our mechanic Ping, which is made in compliance and also with the help of Elder Entertainment, who are our good friends down in Louisville, Kentucky. And Ping is the sound of the last thread of your sanity snapping and your brain oozing out your ears because of the forbidden knowledge you have just gained. What we do that's unique with sanity, unlike in tabletop games such as Call of Cthulhu, is that we do not set a set number for sanity. Oh no, you decide how sane you are when you read your character backstory. You also decide how each successive thing that happens in the game, because believe me, there will be plenty of them, whether descriptions that were whispering in your ear of blood coming out of the walls, or the feeling of eyes surrounding you, or other wonderful descriptive verbal techniques that we use to scare players in their ears, or catching something that you're not supposed to hear in the soundtrack. One of my favorite things is to play something at a super low volume underneath. In particular for Victim's Ball, there's there's a creepy drum track that I will use underneath proper waltz music. And when players start to slowly hear the odd drum beats that don't match up with the waltz, as I very carefully increase the volume, you could see the sanity ticking away as they're questioning if you're actually hearing it or not.
That sounds so fantastic. Now, if I'm a player, let's say this is my first LARP ever, and I come to play one of your games at a convention, what can I expect? Like, walk me through that experience.
Absolutely. So the first thing that happens when we gather up any players, new and old, we always go over our rules before we begin with anything in the game. We have 2 safety mechanics, a safe word mechanic, and also an emotional temperature check system that I developed after talking to Bridget Jeffries from Miskatonic Repository and Chaosium. Absolutely amazing and brilliant person. The emotional temperature check system is one of my favorite safety tools we've added. After we go over the safety tools, we then go over our 2 mechanics that we have for the game. We run our LARPs very parlor style, borderline Nordic. And what I mean by that is parlor LARPs tend to have a small but very set rule set that aren't necessarily numbers based, but they allow for a lot of free-form narrative. Nordic LARPs are characterized by a lot of consent-based play, and in particular, when it comes to our combat system and how some of our magical abilities work, that's where we lean to more consensus and consent-based on players coming to an agreement on how things will show up in the LARP itself. So after going over our rule set, then we go into the explanation of the setting and the handing out of the characters. We always pre-write our characters for Carcosa because we like to add fun little things hidden in the backstory. That's a lot of the places that we slip our subplots, fun little details that will affect the plot, and also sometimes special abilities into the character sheet, just so that we could add that little bit of, insanity spice to everything.
That sounds incredibly fun, and you really sold me on Mepicon in particular because that's not too far from me. So I hope I get to play one of your games soon.
I can't wait. We're actually going to be debuting a brand new LARP, Error 404 Save Not Found, at Mepicon because the theme is video games, heroes, and villains.
That sounds so fantastic. I love how you can incorporate any theme into your genre. That is a real skill and something that I find really fascinating about your game. So could you kind of write to pretty much anything? Like if the theme was sci-fi, right? You could still do Lovecraft in space.
Oh, we absolutely have done Lovecraft in space. In fact, we have 5 different scenarios, one of which is an online Zoom-based scenario that we wrote during the pandemic, that were all written actually based on the work of, and of course the name of the sci-fi writer escapes me, but it's one of Kevin's favorite sci-fi writers that he based Depths of Space and several others of the LARPs in that series on.
That's excellent. And you brought up the pandemic, and when that happened, for people who weren't already active in LARP at the time, of course, a lot of us who create LARPs couldn't run in person. We couldn't go to conventions or play together in person. So a lot of us went online. Now, I had already developed a digital LARP system, and I found that I preferred to run on like Google Meet or Zoom, and that I really just excel for running for about 6 people at a time. That's kind of my thing. But I understand you have a Discord, which is a whole nother animal, and you also ran online during the pandemic. So if you could please describe how you did that, and specifically what kind of skills are involved in running a LARP on Discord.
So It's actually a little bit separated. While we have our Discord for being able to interact with our fans and sometimes run some tabletop things, we actually ran all of our online LARPs via Zoom. What we did was we specifically designed the game to work within the limits of Zoom. So we had to figure out a setting that would make sense of the fact that the players can see and hear each other, but cannot physically interact with one another. And also utilizing some of Zoom's features, in particular, breakout rooms and the ability to share sound. It meant that I could still do my live sound mixing that I had mentioned previously that we use for immersion. And I was still able to have those separate spaces for people to be able to transition, because sometimes people get sent to another realm, like Carcosa, which is where we get our name. So sometimes we need to just stash them away from everybody for a little bit. And then my husband would be waiting in the breakout room and be able to explain what mind-melting horrors they were experiencing there.
That's fantastic. Yeah, the Zoom breakout room feature was fantastic when it originally debuted. And I'm also really curious about whether you designed diegetically, meaning whether you made like the Zoom and computer interface part of the game. For example, I wrote one called First Bite, Second Birth about vampires, and the new vampire wakes up and the first thing they see is this computer in front of them. And that's their first experience as a vampire. And they go online, and who do they meet but a bunch of other new vampires also trying to figure out their lives and the world. So the Zoom call basically was part of the game. So if somebody had a weird disconnection or somebody talking to them in the background, it wasn't weird and it actually made it more immersive. Did you incorporate Zoom in that way, or were you more using it like the ability to broadcast sounds and stuff to them?
So we actually had a mix of it. We wrote 4 different LARPs that we debuted during the pandemic at a variety of different conventions, Mepicon, Gen Con, there was a running gag online as well. So we actually had a decent mix between just using Zoom's features for what they are, and then as we got more comfortable with Zoom's features, later directly writing them into the game as a specific part of the interface. In particular, the Turing test, which is a favorite of mine, and as a soft sequel to a previous game of ours, the Imitation Game, where a computer tries to read all the names of Azathoth and the world in the process. So we had it be an android posing as one of the testers to see if the humans could figure out which one's the android. So we turned off everyone's video feature and left them only on audio. They couldn't have their names listed. They couldn't have their pictures listed. So everybody just had to go by number and try and guess and figure out who the android was. And I was doing this with a voice modulator program, voice mod, that would change my voice drastically so they wouldn't realize it was me playing the android.
That is amazing. I absolutely love it. There's so much creativity that came out of the pandemic, even though it was overall such an awful thing. I'm always so excited to hear about how people have been using it. And I know you said that the Discord was kind of a separate thing, but I wanted to go back to that because this is all about me filling my knowledge gaps, and I am notoriously terrible at Discord management and keeping players engaged in that particular platform. And for those who don't know, Discord is, I guess I'd call it an app that's also a social media platform where people can create their own channel and have different conversations in there, get notifications. It kind of started mainly because of people streaming, at least in the gaming community. People were streaming on sites like Twitch, and the usage has broadened very widely, and a lot of different brands have their own channels on Discord, or servers on Discord they're called. So if you could explain to me how the heck to manage Discord efficiently for a crowd that's into LARP and tabletop role-playing games, I would sure appreciate it.
I absolutely can, because besides being a co-founder of Carcosa Creations, for near on 2 years, I was the lead storyteller for the By Night Studios official Discord LARP, Miami by Night, which has since changed its name to Legends by Night, because they are progressing to a new chronicle very soon. So in terms of LARP and Discord management, we used a couple of different things to be able to make things run smoothly. If you're familiar with the Mind's Eye Theater system, that is the older system that is soon going to be replaced by the recent Kickstarter, backer kit that was run by Night Studios for Laws of the Night 5. The original Mind's Eye Theater system, a lot of adjudication was done by rock, paper, scissors. So one of the cool things that Discord is able to do is the ability to add bots into a server. We had a rock, paper, scissors bot for being able to do tests against the STs and also tests against fellow players. And that meant that we could keep that particular mechanic of the system, despite it being in a play-by-post text format. There are some other things that we used, such as Google Drive for character sheet management and plot document management. And there were also some really cool things that we were starting to do before I stepped back to focus on our conventions, that we were able to use sheets in a database-like way to be able to organize what active players we have and tied to their character sheets, tied to their DTAs, downtime actions, if for those who are not familiar with the system. Those are actions that take place between main game days. With running on Discord, we're still running on a set schedule. So we would still have downtime actions in between those, even if we still had 24/7 play in between.
That's excellent. Now, you mentioned STs or storytellers, which fill the role of kind of GMs, game masters, DMs, dungeon masters, for those who are more about Dungeons and Dragons. And of course, storytellers, they have a specific role in materials by Night Studios, but they also kind of generally function in other games as well. In that particular game, how many storytellers do you have in place per player? So like, if there are 10 players, they have one storyteller, or how does that work?
So part of the reason why during the chaos of the pandemic that I ended up becoming the lead storyteller was because of a shortage of staff. I became friends with the staff of the game, and then I ended up stepping up because they didn't have enough staff to help run. And the game was running quite lean for quite some time. We did not have necessarily a specific ratio of STs to players. We ran it by venue. So we had the Camarilla venue, we had the Anarch venue, we had Werewolf, and for a time we had Changeling. And then I believe they have a Sabbat venue at this point now. So they have separate Sabbat staff. So specific STs and narrators would focus on their particular venue and then collaborate for things that would end up being cross-venue.
And switching back to in-person LARP. Now, in my experience, I found that one GM or storyteller per about 7 to 10 players is usually optimal, depending on the type of LARP you're running. Is that what you found, or have you had a different experience, or maybe a different experience depending on what type of game it is?
So we at Carcosa Creations, we are a husband and eldritch horror team. Typically, often it is just Kevin and I running these games. Now, occasionally we have cultists that come to help us. We have many long-standing cultists who try and help us with setting up and also with some GMing abilities, but they're not a guarantee from convention to convention. And considering some of our LARPs, yes, can go as small as 7, but as large as 50. Sometimes it is just Kevin and I wrangling a room of 50 people.
How do you wrangle 50 people when you're just two?
Thankfully, our players tend to be very patient. It's chaos. We love the chaos, but by the end of the night, sometimes we're feeling a bit of sanity loss ourselves.
Yeah, I imagine they're kind of lining up to ask questions about what happens if I do this. Is that kind of the sort of feeling of running that sort of game, or like what kinds of things do you have to do in the GM role for your type of game live?
So a lot of times it's if a player is investigating a specific thing or looking to use a specific ability or some form of combat goes off. Those are pretty much the 3 times that we get poked. Otherwise, because of the rather fluid and dynamic way that our stories are created, players are a lot of times busy reacting to what's going on around them and not necessarily needing as much direct GM to player interaction.
And how does combat work in your particular games?
It is fast, it is brutal, and it is not something that you want to have happen to you. The bang system, which was also created in concert with Elder Entertainment, is you have 3 wounds for your entire hit points. 1 wound, ow, that really hurts. 2 wounds, oh dear, I need a doctor now, please. 3 wounds, you're dead. Maybe. This is Lovecraft
brutal.
after all. We will find other uses for our players. Reduce, reuse, reanimate.
I love that. Reduce, reuse, reanimate. Oh, that's fantastic. Now, we've talked a lot about.
Well, we have quite a few conventions still on our docket for the year. The big one that I am in the process of prepping for is Gen Con in Indianapolis, the first week of August. We are going to be running 3 games in partnership with Elder Entertainment. We are running Big Rock Candy Mountain, debuting Crescent and Cross, which is a game that's set in the Crusades, and we are bringing Bedlam Carcosa, one of our classic Madhouse games, there as well in partnership with Elder. And I will be running a not 1, not 2, but 3-night-long LARP in partnership with By Night Studios, the Sanguine Samba. Yes, I can talk, I promise. The Sanguine Samba is meant to be very good to introduce players to LARPing in the vampire lifestyle with the brand new LARP Lite system to make it fast and easy for people to get into vampire LARPing and convention play.
That sounds great. I love Rules Light, so that's very interesting. And if people want to follow you online and connect with you there, where should they do so?
Absolutely. We are on Facebook as Carcosa Creations. Just look for Cece, our tentacle monster mascot, who also makes up the front of our name. We also have a link tree off of our Facebook. So if you go to Linktree and look for Carcosa Creations, you'll find us there. We are on Instagram. We are sort of still on Twitter. And we
as best you can be on Twitter at this point. Yes,
exactly.
I get that.
and we also have our Discord server where we chat and talk with our fans, talk about game design, talk about upcoming conventions, and just hang out and have a good time.
Min Kreiner of Carcosa Creations, thank you so much for your time. And for our listeners, this is Tara Clapper. You can follow us on LARPed. This is the LARPed podcast. You can find us at larped.com or at facebook.com/LARP. Thank you for joining me on this episode of the LARPed podcast. Next time, we'll be talking about LARPed abroad, speaking with LARPers from Europe and beyond. The following music was used for this media project, Building Happiness by Music L Files. You can find this free download at filmmusic.io.